They were born in palaces, crowned in cathedrals, buried in gold, and hated by almost everyone who met them. This isn't royal pageantry, it's a hall of shame. From tyrants in velvet to saints with knives behind their backs, these are the rulers whose crowns came dipped in scandal, blood, and bad decisions. Some lost wars, some lost their heads. All lost the love of their people. Welcome to 25 Most Hated English Royals, a 2-hour descent into the thrones no one should have sat on. Because sometimes the biggest threat to a kingdom is the person wearing the crown. Before we dive headfirst into royal ruin, take a second to subscribe. If you're into power, betrayal, and people who absolutely should not have been in charge, this is your kind of place. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you listening in the dead of night like a Tudor spy? Or during lunch like a modern-day courtier on break? Let's see who's out there in the kingdom. 1. Ethelred II. The Unready. It wasn't that Ethelred was unprepared. It was that he never listened. The nickname Unready is misleading, a linguistic betrayal of Old English subtlety. Unrad meant something closer to bad counsel or ill-advised, a painfully apt epithet for a man whose every decision seemed to wobble between passive doom and aggressive regret. Crowned in 978, he ruled over an England already wobbling under the weight of internal strife and external threats. By the time he was done, the throne was covered in Danish boot prints, and Ethelred was running for his life. Again, the story begins with blood. Not war, not conquest, but fratricide. Ethelred became king because his older half-brother, Edward the Martyr, was mysteriously assassinated at Corfe Castle. Ethelred was only about 10 years old at the time. Coincidence? Maybe. But the bad counsel motif begins here, because whether or not he had any hand in the murder, his entire reign unfolded like a long, slow collapse, built on whispered advice, secret alliances, and unfortunate timing. The real issue wasn't just his youth. Plenty of child kings grow into capable rulers. The problem was what grew around him. His court became a hive of squabbling nobles, factional intrigue, and advisors who treated national survival like an optional group project. And just in time for the final exam, the Vikings came back. Yes, again. The Danelaw was supposed to have settled that. Remember Alfred the Great? Peace, treaties, carved up lands. But under Ethelred's watch, Danish raids escalated into brutal invasions. Entire coastal towns were sacked, villages burned, monks slaughtered. The response? Pay them off. Literally. Enter the Danegeld, a protection racket on a national scale. Ethelred collected enormous taxes from his subjects, only to hand them over to the very people pillaging them. It worked, briefly. Then it didn't. Because once you pay off wolves to leave the door alone, they start sniffing around for a second payment. But the real turning point, the moment Ethelred tipped from unlucky monarch to despised failure, came in 1002, with an act of staggering violence and epic miscalculation, the St. Brice's Day Massacre. In a fit of royal panic or paranoia, Ethelred ordered the killing of all Danes living in England. Men, women, maybe even children. The historical record is foggy, perhaps mercifully. But what's clear is that among the dead was a Danish noblewoman, possibly the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the Danish king. Congratulations, you've just made it personal. From that moment on, England was a game board, and Ethelred was playing against a god-tier opponent. Sweyn invaded, pillaged, and by 1013 he declared himself King of England. Ethelred fled to Normandy. Yes, the King of England ran away, an event not easily forgotten by either contemporaries or chroniclers. It's hard to be popular when you abandon your own throne. Sweyn died suddenly in 1014, and Ethelred returned. But instead of redemption, the comeback tour became a final stumble. He ruled only 2 more years, dying in 1016, just as England slipped into the hands of Canute the Great. The Viking Age didn't just return, It sat on the throne. So why is Ethelred still so widely disliked today, 1,000 years later? Because his reign encapsulates everything we fear in leadership: indecisiveness, misplaced trust, and failure to adapt. Not evil, not madness, just inertia in the face of rising chaos. He didn't command hatred so much as he attracted contempt, which is somehow worse. It's one thing to fall in battle or die a martyr. It's another to become a symbol of avoidable collapse, the kind of figure who makes historians sigh heavily before launching into a timeline of disasters. Even the charters from his reign whisper his legacy: flustered, self-justifying, and weirdly passive. A king at the mercy of his advisors, his enemies, and perhaps most damningly, himself. For someone with such a dramatic life arc, assassination, invasion, massacre, exile, Ethelred's legend remains oddly hollow. He's remembered not for what he did, but for what he didn't. He was there when England began to unravel, and he helped pull the threads. But here's the thing about royal unpopularity: it never exists in a vacuum. Ethelred may have blundered his way through the 11th century, but at least he had the excuse of pressure, invasion, and a rotten council. The next man on our list? He didn't even last 3 years on the throne, and still managed to be hated by nearly everyone who wrote about him. The kind of king who makes you look back on Ethelred and think, well, at least he tried. 2. Harthacnut. Some kings are hated for the wars they started, others for the wars they lost. But Harthacnut? He earned his place in history's burn book simply by arriving late, staying too long, and treating the crown like a personal tax shelter with built-in vengeance privileges. The last of the Danish kings of England, Harthacnut reigned from 1040 to 1042, a short, sharp rule that somehow managed to leave a bitter taste in everyone's mouth. His name may sound like a medieval pastry, but his policies were anything but sweet. If Ethelred was ill-advised, Harthacnut was ill-tempered, ill-timed, and ill-received. Let's rewind. He was the son of Cnut the Great. Yes, that Cnut, the one with the waves and the attempt to prove he wasn't divine by not stopping the tide. Points for humility, at least. When Cnut died in 1035, the kingdom he'd stitched together, England, Denmark, parts of Norway, split like an overstuffed cod pie. Harthacnut was technically king of all of it, but in reality, he couldn't even make it to England for the funeral. He was stuck in Denmark, fending off rebellion and watching England slip through his fingers like a bar of wet soap. In his absence, his half-brother Harold Harefoot seized the English throne. Not with bloodshed at first, but with opportunism, quietly claiming power, getting crowned, and keeping Harthacnut out like an awkward cousin locked out of the family reunion. It took 5 years, the death of Harold, and a very suspicious invitation from English nobles for Harthacnut to finally arrive and claim his rightful throne. What did he do first? Did he tour the kingdom, win hearts and minds, maybe offer a tax break? No, he dug up Harold's corpse. That's not a metaphor. He literally had his half-brother's body exhumed from its royal grave, publicly beheaded the remains, and tossed them into a marsh. An act of justice? Maybe in Harthacnut's mind. But to the average English subject, this smelled less like royal authority and more like a very expensive tantrum. It got worse. Harthacnut's rule became synonymous with oppressive taxation, the kind that doesn't just bleed the nobility, but makes peasants start sketching out pitchfork budgets. Needing to fund his navy and secure his shaky rule, he imposed levies so heavy that even contemporaries described them as intolerable. One Anglo-Saxon chronicle entry practically sighs in despair at the king's relentless tax schemes. Then there was the incident in Worcester, one of the most disastrous PR moves of the decade. The locals refused to pay a particularly outrageous tax. Harthacnut, in response, sent an army to burn the town. Not intimidate, not negotiate. Burn. The city went up in flames, its people scattered, and its hatred for the king hardened like scorched earth. He was also noted for being constantly surrounded by Danes, imported allies, mercenaries, and courtiers, who seemed more interested in plundering than governing. This only widened the rift between the Anglo-Saxon populace and their increasingly foreign-feeling monarch. The image of Harthacnut became one of a distant, punitive outsider, someone more interested in revenge than restoration, more at home collecting gold than building peace. And then, just as quickly as he arrived, he died. In 1042, while attending a wedding feast in Lambeth, he collapsed while toasting the bride and groom. Dead before he hit the floor. No violent end, no final words, just gone. The chroniclers, not known for subtlety, seemed almost relieved. One described him as a harsh and severe king, and added, not so subtly, that his death was a kind of divine mercy. So why does Harthacnut's short reign leave such a lingering mark of distaste? Because he represents the worst of dynastic leftovers, entitled, disconnected, brutal when it didn't count, and passive when it did. He left no children, no legacy, and barely a memory worth salvaging. Even the Danes didn't mourn him much. His death opened the door for Edward the Confessor, and the slow unraveling of Anglo-Saxon rule that would culminate in 1066. In many ways, Harthacnut was the last gasp of the North Sea Empire, and what a graceless gasp it was. If Ethelred was a king who lost his kingdom through hesitation, Harthacnut managed to offend his way into irrelevance. He spent years earning the throne, then seemed bored of it the moment he got it. And in that flicker of failed vengeance, he handed history a cautionary tale. That power without connection becomes tyranny, and tyranny without tact becomes a footnote. But before England could move on to anything resembling stability, it had to endure one more ironic twist, because the next king wasn't just hated. He was mocked, feared, and then, quite possibly, murdered. A man whose crown came soaked in suspicion, and whose death only deepened the legend of his failure. And that was Harthacnut. Proof that even a short reign can leave a long, bitter aftertaste. If you've made it this far into the royal disaster parade, go ahead and subscribe. We've got 23 more monarchs to dethrone, and it only gets messier from here. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you tuning in from an ancient castle at midnight, or hiding in a modern office at 3 p.m. pretending to work? Either way, you're in the right place. 3. William II. Rufus. They called him Rufus for his red hair and ruddy complexion, but if you asked the monks chronicling his reign, the color suited him for other reasons. Red like arrogance, red like anger, red like the light from a fire you didn't start but definitely encouraged. William II, son of William the Conqueror, was the kind of king who could make tyranny look like an administrative style. He wasn't hated because he failed. He was hated because he seemed to enjoy it. When his father died in 1087, the empire William the Conqueror had carved out from Normandy to England was already a fragile compromise of blood and borders. William had divided it up like a tired parent assigning chores. Normandy went to his eldest son, Robert Curthose, the dreamer. England went to his middle son, William Rufus, the opportunist. The youngest, Henry, got a chest of silver and, as fate would have it, a head start on the throne. William Rufus was not his father. He didn't inspire fear through grandeur or legitimacy. He inspired it by being unpredictable. He ruled England like a landlord whose only management strategy was intimidation. Chroniclers describe him as hot-tempered, sarcastic, and irreverent toward both the church and his barons. In a time when kings still needed divine PR, Rufus went out of his way to offend the clergy, treating bishops like overpaid accountants and abbots like rivals for the spotlight. His first major act as king was, of course, to raise money. The Norman elite were already drowning in taxation, and Rufus made sure to wring every last coin from their swollen estates. But what made him truly despised was the way he dealt with church property. When a bishopric or abbey became vacant, instead of appointing a new leader, Rufus simply kept the revenue. He turned holiness into a profit margin. Monks prayed for his death not out of revenge, but out of sheer administrative exhaustion. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, became his moral nemesis, a man of quiet conviction up against a king who seemed to believe faith was an optional subscription service. Rufus humiliated him publicly, mocked his piety, and refused to grant him the independence the church demanded. Their conflict became a kind of moral theater for the age. Heaven versus arrogance, principle versus profit. And in the chronicles that followed, Rufus was cast as the villain with unnerving ease. But his secular reputation wasn't much better. He alienated nobles by playing them off against each other, enforcing laws selectively, and handing out land grants to whoever amused him most. He rewarded loyalty with suspicion and betrayal with negotiation. In one famous instance, after a rebellion led by his own uncle, Rufus offered pardons to the rebels while punishing the loyalists who'd supported him. Even by royal standards, that was bold cynicism. The message was clear. Loyalty had no fixed currency. And yet, beneath the tyranny and bluster, there was calculation. Rufus was a pragmatist in an age obsessed with divine justification. He didn't pretend to be holy. He didn't even pretend to be beloved. He seemed to know that fear was faster and far cheaper than love. He was the medieval version of the boss who insists, "I'm not here to make friends." Still, the strange thing about William Rufus is how his story ends. Not in war, not in rebellion, but in the quiet of a forest. In August 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, land his father had famously seized from English villagers decades earlier, Rufus was struck by an arrow. The shot came from one of his own men, Walter Tyrrell. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, it was an open invitation to conspiracy. Some say Tyrrell fled in panic. Others suggest he rode straight to Henry, who wasted no time seizing the royal treasury and the crown. The speed with which Henry became king tells its own story. Whatever happened in that forest, England was ready to move on. The chroniclers, ever moralizing, saw poetic justice in the event. The Red King dying under red skies in his father's cursed woods. They painted it as divine retribution, a celestial audit finally catching up with a man who had taxed both his people and his God. Modern historians are less certain. Perhaps it was an accident, perhaps not. But one thing is sure. Few mourned him. His own servants abandoned his body, hauling it in a cart to Winchester, as if eager to be rid of the responsibility. William Rufus's legacy is one of isolation. No wife, no children, no allies who truly cared. Even his burial was a bureaucratic afterthought. He ruled for 13 years and left nothing behind but resentment and suspicion. The irony, of course, is that in his contempt for religion, he ensured that religion wrote his obituary, and wrote it unkindly. Every monk's quill that described his arrogance became a moral sermon, every red adjective a metaphor for sin. He remains, to this day, a mystery wrapped in mockery, a king too modern for his time and too proud for his own survival. And yet, compared to what came next, his chaos almost seems quaint. Because the next royal didn't just inherit instability, he practically invited it in, offering civil war as an after-dinner entertainment. 4. Stephen of Blois. You know you're unpopular when your reign becomes known not for its policies or victories, but for a 2-decade national breakdown simply called the anarchy. Stephen of Blois didn't just lose control. He turned kingship into an ongoing existential crisis. England during his reign wasn't ruled, it was endured. Stephen became king in 1135, but not because he was next in line. That honor belonged to Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I, and technically the rightful heir. But Stephen moved quickly. With the king newly dead and the court still blinking in confusion, Stephen galloped to London, secured support from key nobles and clergy, and had himself crowned before anyone could object with something inconvenient like a legal claim. It was a coup in everything but name, and its success rested less on merit than momentum. At first, the people may have hoped for stability. Stephen was the grandson of William the Conqueror after all. A seasoned nobleman, charming, generous to a fault. But within months, it was clear. He was no administrator, no commander, and certainly no peacemaker. He governed like a man trying to juggle lit torches in a wind tunnel. Frenetic, unsure, and forever reacting to fires of his own making. The core issue was legitimacy. Matilda never accepted Stephen's coronation, and neither did a significant number of powerful barons. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war. Barons shifting loyalties like chess pieces, castles changing hands overnight, and the royal court wandering the countryside like a refugee caravan with ceremonial banners. Royal authority became little more than a suggestion, and violence wasn't a last resort. It was the schedule. Chroniclers wrote with rare exhaustion. One entry from the Peterborough Chronicle famously reads, "Christ and his saints slept." That wasn't poetic hyperbole, it was observational despair. Villages were pillaged by private armies. New castles sprang up like weeds, many of them unauthorized, turning England into a patchwork of fortified fiefdoms. Justice disappeared. Trade suffered. Taxes were levied arbitrarily when they were levied at all. Kingship no longer seemed divine. It looked desperately freelance. Stephen's biggest flaw wasn't cruelty. It was weakness. He tried to please everyone and ended up trusted by no one. He made promises he couldn't keep, offered pardons to rebels, and allowed enemies back into positions of power, only to be betrayed again. His enemies, notably Matilda and her son Henry, the future Henry II, capitalized on his inconsistencies. Whenever he gained ground militarily, he lost it diplomatically, and when he struck agreements, they collapsed under the weight of his indecision. In 1141, during one of the Civil War's more theatrical moments, Stephen was captured in battle and imprisoned. Matilda was briefly declared Lady of the English, but her own arrogance and political missteps alienated London's population. Within months, the roles reversed. Stephen was back, and the anarchy resumed. Back and forth, like a seesaw made of iron and blood. No side had the strength or the support to finish the job. England was stuck in limbo, ruled not by law, but by inertia. By the late 1140s, even Stephen seemed tired of being king. His reign became a long, drawn-out stalemate. No grand visions, no real reforms, just a man trying to stay in the chair while the room fell apart around him. Finally, in 1153, with his own son Eustace dead and the kingdom on the brink of yet another phase of chaos, Stephen did the one sensible thing of his reign. He negotiated peace. The Treaty of Winchester made Matilda's son Henry his official heir. When Stephen died in 1154, the crown passed without further war. It was, perhaps, the only moment of clarity in a reign defined by contradiction. A usurper who never secured his throne. A king who couldn't govern. A peacemaker too late. Stephen isn't hated for being evil. He's hated for what happened because of him, for the void he created, the chaos he couldn't stop, the suffering he allowed through sheer indecision. The anarchy wasn't just a civil war. It was a slow bleed of faith in monarchy itself. And if his reign taught the realm anything, it was that power without strength breeds catastrophe. But from that exhausted kingdom rose a boy who'd grown up watching this mess unfold. A king in waiting who would come to the throne with fire in his blood and vengeance in his paperwork. And he wouldn't be content just to rule. He wanted to control everything. 5. Henry II of England. If Stephen was the king who couldn't rule, Henry II was the king who couldn't stop. He was tireless, brilliant, short-tempered, and terrifyingly efficient. The kind of man who saw loyalty as currency, laws as weapons, and people as chess pieces he would gladly sacrifice for a better endgame. Where his predecessor hesitated, Henry charged. And where others begged for peace, Henry demanded order, on his terms and no one else's. But with all that energy came collateral damage. A lot of it. Crowned in 1154, Henry inherited a kingdom that barely remembered how to function. Decades of civil war had left England fractured, lawless, and cynically used to barons ruling like local warlords. Henry, just 21 at the time, hit the ground not running, but sprinting. Within a few years he had crushed rogue castles, reformed the justice system, expanded royal authority, and restored something resembling centralized government. People didn't like him, but they liked chaos even less. That didn't mean they respected him unconditionally. Henry was a storm in human form, impossible to predict and harder to stop. He micromanaged everything. He traveled constantly. He was as much a continental ruler as an English one, with vast holdings in France through his mother Matilda and his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. In fact, at the height of his power, Henry controlled more of France than the actual king of France. Not that it helped his charm. For all his achievements, Henry sowed resentment like a farmer sows wheat. His barons resented his interference. His sons resented his control. And the church resented everything about him. That brings us to the conflict that defined and darkened his reign, his battle with Thomas Becket. Becket had been Henry's drinking buddy, courtier, and eventual Archbishop of Canterbury, a job Henry expected him to perform like a loyal administrator. Becket, however, took the job and his vows seriously. The conflict became a medieval morality play. Henry wanted to control clerical courts and reduce the church's independence. Becket resisted. What started as a jurisdictional argument became a bitter, high-stakes feud that escalated beyond politics into spiritual warfare. And then came the infamous fallout. Henry never explicitly ordered Becket's death. That much is agreed upon. But his angry mutterings, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" were taken as a green light by 4 knights who rode to Canterbury and settled things permanently. Henry was horrified, or at least claimed to be. Becket was martyred, canonized, and immortalized. Henry was left to do penance, barefoot in the snow, publicly whipped by monks. It was political theater, but the damage was done. The people had their saint. The church had its martyr, and Henry had a black mark on his soul he could never quite wash off. Even beyond Becket, Henry's rule was a parade of bitter ironies. His attempt to consolidate power backfired catastrophically when his own family rose against him. Eleanor, once his brilliant queen and ally, turned against him and supported their sons, most notably Richard and the ever-troublesome Henry the young king, in open rebellion. It's one thing to be disliked by your nobles. It's another to be despised by your wife and children. By the end of his reign, Henry was a man surrounded by betrayal, exhausted, paranoid, and dying in a castle under siege by the son he once groomed for greatness. When he finally died in 1189, his last words were allegedly a curse against his ungrateful offspring. Fitting. So why is Henry II remembered with such a conflicted legacy? Because he made the state stronger, but made himself hated. He reformed justice, but undermined faith. He crushed rebellion, but bred it in his own house. He was an architect of empire, a master of law, and yet fundamentally incapable of peace, either in the realm or within his own family. Henry gave England back its spine, but in the process, he shattered almost every relationship that could have made him beloved. Still, if Henry's reign was an overcorrection from Stephen's chaos, the next king would make him look like a master of subtlety. Because next came the man who redefined royal failure. The king so hated, so spectacularly self-destructive, that even medieval chroniclers couldn't hide their smirks when writing about him. The monarch whose name still stinks of betrayal. 6. King John. If medieval England had Yelp, King John would have negative stars and a comment section that never ends. He's not just disliked, he's the cautionary tale, a punchline in history classes, a villain in Robin Hood legends, and a political failure so complete that even the barons who put him on the throne eventually begged someone, anyone, to take it away. Born in 1166, John was the youngest of Henry II's sons and never meant to rule. His nickname was Lackland, which already tells you how his early resume looked. He wasn't supposed to inherit anything of consequence. But through a mix of accidents, deaths, and civil wars among his older brothers, John stumbled his way to the throne in 1199 after the death of Richard the Lionheart. And that's when things began to unravel, quickly. To begin with, John lacked what medieval kings needed most: personal charisma and military presence. He wasn't inspiring, commanding, or beloved. What he did have was a sharp mind and a suspicious nature, two traits that, when combined with insecurity and ambition, led him down a path of betrayal, paranoia, and political self-sabotage. His early reign was marked by a catastrophic foreign policy. Within just a few years, John lost almost all the English-controlled territories in France, including Normandy, the jewel of the Angevin Empire, to King Philip II of France. It wasn't just a military disaster, it was an emotional and financial blow to the Anglo-Norman elite, many of whom had family lands and loyalties across the Channel. And unlike Richard or even Henry II, John didn't inspire loyalty to make up for the losses. He blamed others, shuffled allies, and taxed those who couldn't run away fast enough. Ah yes, taxation. If there's one area where John excelled, it was squeezing money from his barons. Whether through random fines, inflated feudal dues, or blatant legal manipulation, John turned the royal treasury into a weapon. Justice was for sale, rights were conditional, and nobody was safe from financial exploitation. He famously charged outrageous fees for inheritances, marriages, and court verdicts. His reign was less a monarchy and more a very expensive extortion racket. Even worse, his relationships were disasters, domestically and internationally. His marriage was controversial. His treatment of allies was unpredictable. His feud with Pope Innocent III reached such ridiculous heights that the entire kingdom was placed under interdict, meaning no church services, no sacraments, no burials. It was spiritual blackmail on a national scale. For years, England lived in theological limbo while John refused to back down, until he eventually gave in, surrendered the kingdom to the Pope, and agreed to pay annual tribute to Rome just to get his excommunication lifted. A king who literally sold his crown's independence to make a problem go away. But the moment that sealed his fate came in 1215, when a group of fed-up barons forced John to the negotiating table. The result was Magna Carta, a document that, while not revolutionary at the time, became the most famous limitation of royal power in history. It was born not out of grand ideals but out of desperation. The barons didn't trust him. The church didn't trust him. His own officials didn't trust him. And John, being John, signed the document and almost immediately tried to break every clause in it. Civil war followed. Again, because with John everything ended in conflict. When he died in 1216, mid-war, bloated with stress and widely despised, the chroniclers practically exhaled in relief. One monk wrote dryly that hell itself is too foul a place to welcome him. Whether literal or metaphorical, the sentiment stuck. So why does King John remain so widely hated, even centuries later? Because he managed to combine the worst qualities of a ruler: weak in battle, greedy in peacetime, and vindictive in diplomacy. He didn't just lose land, he lost trust. He didn't just tax heavily, he insulted the very idea of justice. He wasn't just unloved, he was actively distrusted by everyone who knew him. And yet, history doesn't always punish incompetence equally, because the next king ruled for over 50 years, longer than any English monarch before him. And somehow, despite having every chance to learn from John's failures, he turned the throne into a revolving door of rebellions, debts, and disasters of his own making. 7. Henry III of England. If King John was the storm, then Henry III was the long gray drizzle that followed. His reign didn't crash, it dragged. 56 years on the throne, and what did England get? No conquests, no glory, and certainly no unity. Just decades of simmering resentment, political misfires, and a monarch who never quite grasped why everyone was always so upset. Crowned as a child in 1216, Henry inherited a fractured kingdom at war, barely held together by regents and papal support. And for a moment, it looked like England might recover. The barons who'd rebelled against his father were exhausted. The French prince they'd briefly invited in as a replacement king had been pushed out. There was even a sense that, under new leadership, England could rebuild. But then Henry grew up, and things went sideways. Slowly. Henry III was not a tyrant. That would have been too exciting. Instead, he was naive, pious, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. His devotion to religion was theatrical. He spent lavishly on churches, especially Westminster Abbey, which he nearly rebuilt from scratch. But while his architectural legacy is grand, his political legacy is not. The core of Henry's unpopularity was favoritism. He surrounded himself with foreigners, relatives of his Savoyard and Lusignan in-laws, handing them titles, estates, and influence at the expense of native barons. These outsiders were seen as parasites, siphoning off royal favor while bypassing traditional channels of power. It was the medieval equivalent of your boss promoting his cousin from abroad to manage the whole department. Worse, Henry's financial habits made King John look thrifty. He borrowed constantly, ran up debts with Italian bankers, and taxed his subjects with an entitled sense of divine purpose. And when he couldn't raise enough at home, he tried to purchase the crown of Sicily for one of his sons, without asking Parliament, without real support, and without any realistic hope of success. The resulting fiasco nearly bankrupted him, embarrassed England abroad, and lit the match under a baronial powder keg. Enter Simon de Montfort. Montfort, Henry's brother-in-law and a respected noble, became the unlikely champion of a fed-up aristocracy. He demanded reforms, limits on royal spending, accountability for ministers, and regular meetings of Parliament. Henry agreed, then backtracked, then agreed again, then ignored it. The result? Civil war. Again. In 1264, Montfort's forces defeated the king at the Battle of Lewes and captured both Henry and his heir, the future Edward I. For over a year, England was effectively ruled by Montfort, a brief experiment in constitutional monarchy. But it didn't last. Royalist forces, led by Edward, eventually crushed Montfort at Evesham. Henry was restored. The reforms were undone. And England learned, once again, that trusting its monarch to play fair was a losing bet. By the time Henry died in 1272, he had ruled longer than any English king before him. But longevity isn't legacy. His reign had become a cautionary tale of missed opportunities, bad advisors, and empty gestures. The country he left behind was tired. Tired of foreign favorites, tired of inconsistent governance, and tired of waiting for a king who would finally take things seriously. Why was Henry III hated? Because he confused piety for competence, extravagance for vision, and obedience for loyalty. He wasn't cruel, but he was careless. Not wicked, but weak. And in a century bursting with political energy, that kind of apathy was its own form of betrayal. Still, if Henry III was a disappointment wrapped in good intentions, his son would swing the pendulum in the other direction. A man determined to rule with an iron fist, defend his rights by any means necessary, and leave no insult unpunished, even if it cost him his crown. 8. Edward II of England. If kingship were a job interview, Edward II would be the candidate who shows up late, forgets his resume, and insists on bringing a controversial friend to sit in on the meeting. And yet, somehow, he still gets hired. His reign wasn't just a failure. It was an unraveling. A slow, tragic, often absurd descent into royal helplessness, played out in full view of a kingdom that was growing increasingly fed up with watching its monarch flounder. Crowned in 1307 after the death of his father, Edward I, the formidable Hammer of the Scots, Edward II was expected to continue the strong, centralized rule his father had built. What he delivered instead was a reign defined by indecisiveness, personal favoritism, military disaster, and public embarrassment. England didn't just lose confidence in its king, it lost patience. From the beginning, Edward II's priorities were perplexing. Rather than consolidating royal authority or addressing the ongoing war with Scotland, he immediately raised his closest companion, Piers Gaveston, to positions of enormous influence. Gaveston wasn't just disliked, he was loathed by the English nobility. Arrogant, flashy, and perceived as manipulative, Gaveston became the lightning rod for a growing storm of aristocratic outrage. Edward ignored the warnings, brushed off Parliament's concerns, and seemed genuinely confused that anyone would object to him handing out power like party favors. The result? A series of humiliating confrontations between the crown and its barons. The Lords Ordainers, an alliance of nobles fed up with Edward's mismanagement, forced reforms limiting royal authority. Gaveston was exiled, then recalled, then exiled again, then captured, tried, and executed by a group of angry lords who no longer saw the king's favor as protection. Edward was furious, but impotent. His grief translated into bitterness, not strategy. And then came Scotland. In 1314, Edward led an army north to relieve the besieged Stirling Castle. Opposing him was Robert the Bruce, a man leading a Scottish rebellion that had simmered under Edward I and now burned brightly under his less capable son. The Battle of Bannockburn followed, a catastrophic defeat for the English, and one of Scotland's most legendary victories. Edward's forces were routed, his reputation shredded. He fled the battlefield in disgrace. The humiliation echoed through every baronial hall in England. This was not a king who inspired fear. This was a king who ran. In the years that followed, Edward's reign limped along through a mire of political resentment. He surrounded himself with new favorites, the Despensers, who managed to be even more reviled than Gaveston. Meanwhile, famine, economic instability, and lawlessness worsened across the country. Parliament grew bolder in its criticisms. So did the nobility, and eventually so did his wife. Isabella of France, Edward's queen, quietly transformed from frustrated consort into active conspirator. In 1326, alongside her ally, and alleged partner, Roger Mortimer, she invaded England with a modest force and found, shockingly, little resistance. The nobility abandoned Edward. His army evaporated. He fled, was captured, and in 1327 was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. It was the first time an English king had been officially deposed. That's not the kind of precedent you want your reign to end with. So why was Edward II so thoroughly hated? Because he turned kingship into a farce. Not by being cruel or tyrannical, but by being inattentive, selfish, and disastrously unfit. He alienated his nobles, lost battles he never should have fought, and treated the crown like a private estate. Even his own son would later go to great lengths to erase the damage and distance himself from the wreckage. But England, ever consistent in its capacity for royal disappointment, wasn't finished. Because next came a boy king with grand visions and dangerous enemies, a monarch who would begin with promise and end in deposition, betrayal, and a quiet cell far from the throne he was never quite able to hold. 9. Richard II of England. Richard II came to the throne as a child, and for a while, England seemed willing to believe that youth might be a virtue. A clean slate, a fresh start, maybe even a future king who would learn from the chaos of his ancestors. But what began with hope gradually decayed into suspicion, then frustration, and finally rebellion. Richard's reign became a cautionary tale, not about war or conquest, but about what happens when a king mistakes his throne for a stage and his crown for a spotlight. Crowned at age 10 in 1377, Richard inherited a kingdom weary from war and riddled with tension. England was still knee-deep in the 100 Years' War, taxes were high, and resentment simmered just beneath the surface. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was one of the first real tests of Richard's reign, and oddly enough, it was also one of his few early successes. At just 14, he famously rode out to meet the rebel leaders himself, offering words of conciliation while buying time for his forces to crush the uprising. For a brief moment, Richard looked like a monarch born of crisis, brave, decisive, and capable. But as he matured, that image warped. Instead of becoming the strong king his people hoped for, Richard began to see kingship not as a duty, but as a divine performance. He surrounded himself with flatterers, excluded powerful nobles from influence, and turned his court into something closer to a royal theater than a political institution. Style overtook substance. Ceremony replaced governance. Richard was obsessed with image, lavish clothing, elaborate symbolism, and endless processions designed to make his authority look unquestionable, even as it became increasingly questioned. His disdain for the older nobility only widened the rift. The Lords Appellant, a group of high-ranking peers, confronted him in the late 1380s, accusing his inner circle of corruption and incompetence. The result was the merciless Parliament of 1388, where many of Richard's allies were tried and executed. He bided his time, waiting for the political tides to turn, and they did. A few years later, he reasserted control, punished his enemies, and embarked on what many historians call his tyranny. He exiled or executed opponents, ruled without parliament, and made a habit of confiscating noble estates to enrich himself and his favorites. His reign became not a partnership with the realm, but a personal crusade for vengeance and validation. Even his most ambitious act, his expedition to Ireland, felt more like a theatrical escape than a strategic campaign. While Richard played conqueror abroad, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke was rallying support at home, and when Richard returned in 1399, he found the game was already lost. His allies had scattered. His crown was taken. His power evaporated not with a bang, but with a signature. Henry became King Henry IV, and Richard was quietly imprisoned, removed from the stage he'd so lovingly decorated. Why was Richard II so disliked? Because he mistook kingship for a divine entitlement, not a political craft. He ruled like a man writing a poem no one else wanted to read, florid, dramatic, and hopelessly detached from reality. In the end, Richard wasn't feared like his grandfather Edward III or hated like King John. He was pitied and then discarded. But where Richard's fall was slow and poetic, his successor's legacy would be something else entirely. Because next came a man who wasn't weak, or theatrical, or indecisive. He was simply absent. A king who ruled in name while the world fell apart around him. A crown propped up by ghosts, worn by a man who barely knew he was wearing it. 10. Henry VI of England. Henry VI didn't just lose his throne, he lost it twice. And not in some grand battlefield tragedy or due to a heroic last stand. No, Henry's downfall came in slow motion, over decades, like watching a building crumble from within. He was a king defined not by action, but by absence, of will, of strength, and eventually of presence itself. Crowned as an infant in 1422 after the death of his father, Henry V, the warrior king whose victories in France had cemented the English claim to the French crown, Henry VI inherited an empire and a myth. But the myth came with expectations, and the boy who grew into the crown never came close to meeting them. From the very start, the signs were clear: quiet, devout, passive, and painfully ill-suited for the brutality of 15th-century kingship. Where his father was all fire and steel, Henry was soft words and silent rooms. It wasn't just that he wasn't aggressive, it was that he seemed disconnected. He avoided court politics, struggled with decision-making, and was notoriously susceptible to manipulation by those around him. Factionalism flourished under his gaze. Nobles built power blocks, foreign policy drifted, and local lawlessness spread like mold in a damp hall. The English crown, once the symbol of continental ambition, became a prize in a long, grinding war between noble families. And then there was France. The 100 Years' War didn't end with a bang, but with a slow, humiliating retreat. Under Henry's reign, England lost virtually all its French holdings, including Normandy and, finally, Bordeaux. By 1453, Calais was all that remained. The glory days of Agincourt were over. In their place came military blunders, weak leadership, and a national identity crisis. People didn't just lose land, they lost pride. And that loss had a name: Henry. Even worse, Henry's mental health began to fracture. He suffered from extended periods of catatonia, during which he could neither speak nor recognize those around him. During one episode in 1453, coincidentally the year England lost its last real grip on France, he was unresponsive for over a year. He had a son during that time, but reportedly had no memory of the child's birth. England, in turn, had a king who wasn't really there. Into that vacuum stepped the House of York. The Wars of the Roses erupted not simply because of dynastic claims, but because the country could no longer pretend Henry was capable of rule. Richard, Duke of York, challenged Henry's authority, and what followed was over 2 decades of shifting power, civil war, and dynastic bloodletting. Henry was deposed in 1461 by Edward IV, restored briefly in 1470 in what historians call the readeption, and then removed again in 1471. Each time, he returned weaker, more broken, more visibly unfit. Why was Henry VI so unpopular? Because his reign wasn't just ineffective, it was dispiriting. He offered no vision, no stability, and no control. His piety, once admired, became a symbol of detachment. His court became a battleground for power-hungry nobles, and his inability to govern turned the crown into a contested object rather than a source of authority. Even his personal kindness, so often praised in isolation, was useless in a country that needed decisions, not devotions. When he finally died in the Tower of London in 1471, there was little mourning outside the circles of the loyal few. The Lancastrian dream died with him, fragile, passive, and already eclipsed by men who knew how to seize and hold power. And yet, the cruelty of kingship is that one generation's weakling can be another's martyr. But history didn't have time to ponder that. Because next came a boy who barely wore the crown at all. A child swallowed by a dynasty's ambition, whose vanishing act would become one of the darkest legends in royal history. 11. Edward V of England. Edward V is less a king than a question mark. Technically, he was monarch. Briefly. Legally, sort of. Politically, barely. But historically, he's a ghost, a cipher, a name in the royal succession followed by a vanishing act so complete that centuries later, it still sparks theories, accusations, and conspiracy documentaries. And yet, despite being a child, despite ruling for mere weeks, Edward V earned a place among England's most disliked royals, not because of what he did, but because of what his reign, or lack thereof, symbolizes: dynastic betrayal, political manipulation, and the collapse of royal innocence. Born in 1470, Edward was the eldest son of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, a golden boy raised amid the glitter of a briefly stable Yorkist court. Groomed for kingship, educated in the princely virtues, and named Prince of Wales before he could walk straight. The future seemed written in stone. But when Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, everything turned to sand. At just 12 years old, Edward V was declared king. But before he could even be crowned, the machinery of ambition kicked into gear. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, rode in to protect the boy and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. As Lord Protector, Richard had the power to manage the kingdom until Edward came of age. But instead of arranging a coronation, he arranged a takeover. First, he seized Edward and placed him in the Tower of London, officially for his safety. Then he arrested key members of the Woodville family. Next came the legal maneuver, a claim that Edward IV's marriage was invalid, making his children illegitimate. And just like that, Parliament declared Edward V unfit for the crown. Richard was crowned Richard III. Edward V went from monarch to prisoner in less than 3 months. And then, silence. No more letters, no more sightings, no more Edward. He and his brother were last seen playing within the walls of the tower. Then they were gone. No body, no trial, no official explanation. Just rumors, whispers, accusations, theories. So why is Edward V, a child with no real reign, on the list of most hated royals? Because sometimes being hated isn't about personal failure. Sometimes it's about what your existence represents. Edward V became the symbol of royal helplessness, of how easily the crown could be stolen, of how little innocence protected you, even if you were the rightful king. His brief rule exposed the ugliest mechanics of power: family betrayal, ruthless ambition, and the willingness of nobles to rewrite the rules when it suited them. In the centuries that followed, public sympathy would favor Edward, painting him as a tragic victim. But in his own time, even among those who might have rallied to his side, he was mostly abandoned, forgotten, discarded, inconvenient. His disappearance created a vacuum, and England, as always, rushed to fill it. Because the man who replaced him didn't just take the crown. He took the legend, the suspicion, and the hatred that would follow him for the rest of history. A king whose name became shorthand for betrayal. A monarch many believe murdered his own nephews to wear the crown. A villain, or perhaps a scapegoat, depending on whom you ask. 12. Richard III of England. Few monarchs have been so thoroughly buried by reputation, literally and figuratively, as Richard III. For centuries, he was the villain in England's royal soap opera, the crook-backed usurper, the boy-murdering tyrant, the last Plantagenet whose death on the battlefield was treated as divine house-cleaning. Thanks to Shakespeare, he became a caricature of evil, scheming, manipulative, and practically hissing. But even before the bard took poetic license, Richard was already deeply unpopular. Not necessarily because of what he did, but because of what people believed he did, and the uncomfortable possibility that some of it might have been true. Born in 1452, Richard was the youngest son of Richard, Duke of York, and brother to King Edward IV. He earned his reputation early on as a loyal lieutenant, fighting bravely in the Wars of the Roses, serving as governor of the North, and being one of the few Yorkist nobles who didn't immediately crash into scandal. By the time Edward IV died in 1483, Richard was seen as a steady hand, albeit a severe one. But what happened next rewired English politics forever. As Lord Protector to the new king, his 12-year-old nephew Edward V, Richard initially claimed to support a smooth transition, but almost immediately he seized control. He intercepted the young king on the road to London, arrested his Woodville relatives, and lodged the boy and his younger brother in the Tower of London. Within weeks, a case was made that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid, rendering his sons illegitimate. Parliament, never one to fight against a sharp legal argument backed by armed guards, confirmed this. Richard took the crown. The boys in the tower were never seen again. This, right here, is the black hole of Richard's legacy. Were the princes in the tower murdered? If so, by whom? Richard had the clearest motive and means, but there was no trial, no confession, and no bodies. At least, not until 2 small skeletons were found centuries later. The lack of certainty only deepened the public's suspicion. Richard might have been innocent, or not, but he wore the guilt regardless. Richard's reign, though short, just over 2 years, was defined by tension. He tried to assert control with reforms and legal measures, including laws that protected landowners from fraudulent lawsuits and increased the accessibility of bail. These might have earned him credit under different circumstances. But in a kingdom still whispering about missing princes, every action felt suspect. His attempts at kingship were weighed down by an aura of illegitimacy. His authority never quite settled. And then came Bosworth. In 1485, Henry Tudor landed with a modest army and a dynastic claim so flimsy it might have been written on parchment in hope. Yet Richard's support had eroded. He marched out to meet Henry at Bosworth Field, and lost. Killed in battle, the last English king to die that way. His body was stripped, mocked, and buried hastily without ceremony. His crown passed to Henry VII, and with it, the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. The Plantagenets were gone. Richard was gone. And so began the cleanup job. Richard III's memory was quickly rewritten by the Tudors, by chroniclers, by playwrights. He became a moral villain, a historical scapegoat. Some of it stuck because people already believed it. Some of it stuck because history, like politics, prefers simple explanations. A usurper, a murderer, an ambitious uncle who couldn't wait his turn. But why was Richard III so hated even before the fiction? Because he violated the invisible code of monarchy. He didn't just take the crown, he took it from children, from family, from within. His reign asked a question England wasn't ready to answer. What do you do when the legitimate ruler disappears, and the only one left standing is the man who benefited most? And if Richard was the final chapter of Plantagenet rule, his successor would be the author of a whole new kind of royal power. A king with charm, control, and the willingness to rewrite not just history, but religion itself. 13. Henry VIII of England. If you were to create a checklist of everything people historically despise in a monarch, cruelty, wastefulness, vanity, betrayal, paranoia, and a flair for casual tyranny, Henry VIII wouldn't just tick all the boxes. He'd tear up the list, declare it treasonous, and have it rewritten to suit his latest whim, and then probably execute the clerk who drafted it. Henry VIII remains one of the most infamous kings in English history, not because he was a failure, but because his successes were often built on the wreckage of everything else. He reigned for 38 years, expanded the power of the monarchy, founded the Church of England, and ruled with a brutal decisiveness that gave the crown new reach. But he also left behind a kingdom drenched in fear, drained of funds, and scarred by the legacy of a king who mistook his own will for divine right. Born in 1491, Henry wasn't originally destined to be king. That role belonged to his older brother, Arthur, who died young. When Henry took the throne in 1509, he was young, athletic, charismatic, everything a Renaissance monarch was supposed to be. For a time, the people adored him. But early promise has a short shelf life, especially in a man with unlimited power and no appetite for restraint. Henry's early reign was traditional: tournaments, wars with France, courtly spectacle. But then came the problem. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, produced only one surviving child, Mary. No male heir. And with no male heir, Henry's paranoia blossomed. His response was seismic. He sought an annulment from the Pope. When the Pope refused, Henry broke with Rome entirely. Thus began the English Reformation, not born of theology, but of dynastic desperation. The king declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, dissolved the monasteries, seized their wealth, and reshaped the country's religious landscape, all to secure a new marriage. In the process, centuries of Catholic tradition were uprooted. Monks were expelled, churches ransacked, entire communities spiritually disoriented. Reformers called it progress. Detractors called it theft in holy robes. Then came the marriages, 6 of them. Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne again, Catherine again, and Catherine one more time. The fates of these queens, divorced, executed, died, divorced, executed, survived, have become a grim rhyme whispered in history classrooms. And while Henry's marital motives were dressed up in legal and theological arguments, they were ultimately personal. He wanted a son. He wanted control. He wanted to be adored and obeyed, even when he changed his mind. Politically, Henry was no less ruthless. He elevated ministers like Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell to dizzying heights, only to discard them when they fell out of favor. He used Parliament when it suited him and ignored it when it didn't. Nobles lived in a state of constant anxiety. Old allies disappeared overnight. Trials were swift and outcomes often predetermined. Under Henry, even silence could be treason. So why is Henry VIII still ranked as one of England's most hated kings? Because his legacy is a contradiction wrapped in royal velvet. He gave England a stronger monarchy, a national church, and a cultural identity separate from Rome. But he did it through coercion, cruelty, and ego. He demanded loyalty and repaid it with suspicion. He reimagined the crown's power, not as a sacred trust, but as a reflection of his own insecurities. And by the end of his life, the man who once dazzled Europe was obese, paranoid, and increasingly isolated. The glorious prince had become a warning. That power without humility will always curdle into tyranny. But as the country reeled from his religious schism and political purges, it was his young son, fragile, fervently Protestant, and terrifyingly surrounded by ambitious men, who would inherit the throne. And what followed wasn't a continuation. It was a sharp lurch into instability, faith-based factionalism, and the haunting sense that England had been broken at the roots. 14. Edward VI of England. Edward VI wasn't supposed to rule for long, and he didn't. But in just 6 short years on the throne, England's boy king managed to alienate large swathes of his subjects, deepen religious divisions, and preside over one of the most chaotic and unpopular reformist regimes the country had yet seen. Though, to be fair, the decisions weren't always his. Edward was young, too young, and that's precisely what made his reign so dangerous. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his 9-year-old son inherited not just a crown, but a kingdom already teetering from religious upheaval. The break with Rome was still raw, the monasteries were gone, and the Catholic-Protestant divide was no longer just theological. It was political, cultural, and deeply personal. Into this volatile mix stepped Edward VI, the boy wonder of Tudor Protestantism. But he wasn't the one doing the stepping. That job fell to the men around him. First came Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, Edward's uncle, who acted as Lord Protector. Then, after Somerset's fall from favor, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, took the reins. Both men claimed to speak for the king. Both used his authority to push their own agendas. And both underestimated the cost of turning England into a Protestant experiment gone wild. Under Edward's name, the Church of England was aggressively restructured. The Latin Mass was abolished. Altars were ripped out. Stained glass windows were smashed. Priests were forced to abandon traditional vestments. The Book of Common Prayer, introduced in 1549 and revised again in 1552, standardized Protestant worship in English, but also alienated large portions of the population who still clung to the old rites. In many parts of the country, especially the West Country and the North, people weren't just upset, they were outraged. The result? Revolts. The most notable, the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549, saw thousands rise up against the new liturgy, demanding the restoration of traditional Catholic practices. It was a brutal affair. The Crown's response was swift and merciless, and while the rebellion was crushed, the message was clear. The Protestant Reformation was no longer a spiritual movement, it was a state-imposed mandate, enforced with steel. Meanwhile, England's economy was tanking. Inflation soared, coinage was debased, enclosure of land by greedy landlords pushed peasants off their farms. Riots flared. Confidence in government eroded. The noble class squabbled among themselves, each trying to steer the boy king's hand toward their own interests. Edward, precocious and devoutly Protestant, seemed eager to play along, more interested in theological purity than political stability. But for all his intelligence, he was still a child, one being slowly devoured by tuberculosis. As his health declined, Edward became obsessed with one final act of control, ensuring a Protestant succession. Fearing that his Catholic half-sister Mary would undo all the religious reforms, he named Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, as his heir. Jane was crowned after Edward's death in 1553, but ruled for only 9 days before Mary rallied support and took the throne. Why is Edward VI remembered with such distaste? Because his reign, while brief, encapsulated the dangers of ideological extremism imposed from above, without consent, without balance, and without care for the ordinary people who bore the consequences. He became, perhaps unfairly, a symbol of a government ruled by clerics and cronies, not by consent or wisdom. He was the face of Protestant reform, but not its architect. A monarch whose brief time on the throne widened rifts that would bleed into the reigns that followed. And what followed was not reconciliation, it was retribution. Because if Edward had tried to erase Catholicism, his sister Mary would respond with fire, steel, and a name that history would never let her shake. 15. Mary I of England. If history is written by the victors, Mary I of England must have really lost. Her reign was short, her policies divisive, and her legacy, well, it's summed up in a nickname she didn't choose and couldn't shake. Bloody Mary. Never mind the nuance, never mind the context. Once the fire starts, no one stops to ask who lit the match. Born in 1516 to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary Tudor had a childhood shaped by rejection and reversal. First declared illegitimate when her father broke with Rome, then restored, then sidelined again under Edward VI's Protestant regime, she learned early that royal blood meant nothing without power to back it up. When Edward excluded her from the line of succession in favor of Lady Jane Grey, Mary didn't blink. She raised an army, took the crown, and restored her claim with force and confidence. For a moment, it looked like Mary would bring a steady hand to a reeling kingdom. But stability was never the point. Mary didn't just want the crown, she wanted a reckoning. Her primary mission was clear from day one: bring England back to Rome. The English Reformation, in her view, was a crime, not just against faith, but against the natural order. Her father had broken with the Pope, dissolved monasteries, and declared himself head of the Church. Her brother had gone further, instituting Protestant liturgy and purging Catholic iconography. Mary's reign was meant to reverse the damage. This wasn't policy, it was penance. So she restored papal authority, repealed Protestant legislation, brought back the Latin Mass. And then she did the one thing that ensured her reputation would never recover. She lit the fires. Between 1555 and 1558, around 280 Protestants were executed for heresy, often burned publicly. Some were prominent theologians. Others were ordinary people. The executions were legal under the restored Catholic laws. But legality doesn't make something palatable. The burnings horrified the public and gave Protestant writers exactly the material they needed to immortalize her in infamy. Fox's Book of Martyrs, a bestseller in the Elizabethan era, painted her as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a woman willing to scorch the land to save souls. But Mary wasn't only unpopular because of the flames. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was a diplomatic miscalculation of epic proportions. The English people, wary of foreign entanglements, viewed it as a betrayal. Philip was Spanish, Catholic, and powerful. And once he arrived, it became clear he had little affection for England, and even less for his wife. Parliament refused to crown him, and Mary's attempts to produce an heir failed, her hopes dashed by false pregnancies and deteriorating health. The longed-for Catholic dynasty never materialized. All she left behind was suspicion. Add to this the loss of Calais in 1558, the last English possession in France, and Mary's unpopularity became sealed in both fire and failure. Calais had been English for over 2 centuries. Losing it wasn't just a military blunder, it was a national humiliation. Mary reportedly said that when she died, Calais would be found written on her heart. Unfortunately, many of her subjects believed the word already burned on it was martyrdom. Not theirs, but her own. So why is Mary I still one of England's most reviled monarchs? Because she ruled like a counter-revolutionary, not with reform, but with vengeance, not with policy, but with purification. She inherited a fractured kingdom and tried to force it back together with fire and prayer, and neither worked. In the end, her devotion outpaced her discernment. And yet, the irony is this. Her most famous critic, her own half-sister, would take the throne next. And while Elizabeth I would become a national icon, she too would inherit the habit of burning dissenters, silencing opposition, and wrapping state violence in the language of virtue. But where Mary failed and was hated, Elizabeth succeeded and was adored. And that, in the cold arithmetic of legacy, makes all the difference. 16. Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth I is often remembered as the Golden Sovereign, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, a beacon of national identity wrapped in pearls, ruffles, and myth. She's plastered across English history like a royal logo, sharp-witted, defiant, undefeated. But beneath the surface of her carefully managed image was a monarch who ruled with cold calculation, ruthless control, and a legacy far more divisive than her glowing PR suggests. Daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, herself a symbol of courtly ambition and political execution, Elizabeth was born into controversy. Declared illegitimate after her mother's beheading, she grew up as a precarious figure in Tudor politics, and by the time she took the throne in 1558, after the short and fiery reign of her sister Mary I, Elizabeth was seen by many as England's great hope, young, Protestant, clever, and unburdened by Spain. But the honeymoon ended quickly. Elizabeth was a master of survival, not sentiment. She never married, famously styling herself as married to England. To her supporters, this was a powerful symbol of independence. To others, it was a dynastic crisis in slow motion. Parliament begged her to take a husband. Foreign suitors lined up. None succeeded. Instead, she dangled her availability like bait, using the prospect of marriage as leverage, not commitment. It worked politically. But domestically, it left England with no clear heir, creating a tension that would hang over her entire reign. Her religious policy, often praised for its moderation, was more about strategic ambiguity than genuine tolerance. She reinstated the Church of England, enforced conformity through the Act of Uniformity, and suppressed both Catholic recusants and radical Protestants. People who failed to attend Anglican services faced fines, imprisonment, and social exclusion. While not as spectacularly violent as her sister Mary's persecutions, Elizabeth's regime quietly created a surveillance state around religious observance. Then there was the matter of Mary, Queen of Scots, a cousin, rival, and Catholic figurehead for countless plots. Elizabeth imprisoned her for nearly 19 years before finally authorizing her execution in 1587. The decision haunted her, publicly at least, and yet politically, it eliminated the one person who could unite Catholic hopes under a single banner. The Virgin Queen did what she always did. She hesitated, delegated, then claimed innocence after the fact. But the crown stayed firmly on her head. Her court was vibrant, theatrical, and carefully managed. She elevated favorites, like Robert Dudley and later the charming but reckless Earl of Essex, only to discard them when they overstepped. Power around Elizabeth was earned through flattery, loyalty, and an instinct for staying in her good graces. Those who misread the tone paid dearly. And despite the glitter of the Elizabethan age, Shakespeare, Drake, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, her reign wasn't universally adored. The later years were marked by increasing taxes, food shortages, rebellion in Ireland, and widespread disillusionment. The cult of personality around her became so performative that some contemporaries began to see through it. A queen who once embodied national confidence now seemed increasingly aloof, paranoid, and brittle. When she died in 1603, she left behind no children, no named heir, and a nation exhausted by courtly games and waiting. So why is Elizabeth disliked by some, even as others elevate her to icon status? Because she played the long game with unrelenting control. She mastered the art of delay, thrived in ambiguity, and ruled through image management long before spin doctors existed. But her strength was also her distance. She was revered, not loved, feared, not followed. And as much as she stabilized England, she also stagnated it, freezing succession, choking reform, and ruling through a cult of personality that could not survive her. Her death marked the end of the Tudors and the arrival of the Stuarts. And her successor would come not from within England, but from the misty north. A man raised with visions of absolute rule and divine favor. A king with ideas far bigger than the crown he inherited. 17. James I of England. James I entered England like a man walking into a room where everyone had already been arguing for hours. He smiled, waved, offered a few theological opinions no one asked for, and then promptly set the drapes on fire. He was the first Stuart King of England, the long-awaited successor to Elizabeth I, and the man who inherited a kingdom bursting with expectation, religious tension, and a chronic distrust of royal ambition. Within a decade, he was widely disliked, not for what he destroyed, but for what he never understood. Born in 1566 and raised in the high-pressure world of Scottish politics, James VI of Scotland had been king since infancy. He survived court coups, regents, kidnappings, and religious chaos. By the time he inherited the English crown in 1603, he believed himself to be not just chosen by God, but rather uniquely qualified to explain divine rule to everyone else. England, unfortunately for him, wasn't in the mood for a lecture. His vision of kingship was expansive. James believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were accountable only to God, not to Parliament or their people. He wrote books about it, long ones. He gave speeches filled with lofty metaphors about fathers and their subjects. It sounded impressive, but to many in England it translated roughly to, "I'll do what I want and you'll smile while I do it." Parliament didn't smile. James's reign was riddled with conflict between Crown and Commons. He resented Parliament's control over the purse strings and believed they should fund his government without asking inconvenient questions. Parliament, for its part, resented his extravagance, his favoritism, and his constant need for money. He showered titles and gifts on a small circle of court favorites, most infamously George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, while the broader nobility looked on with growing disdain. The image of a Scottish outsider lavishing power on other outsiders didn't help his popularity. Then came religion. James fancied himself a theological expert, but his policies were a confused attempt to please everyone, Catholics, Anglicans, and Puritans, and in the process, pleased almost no one. The gunpowder plot of 1605, a failed Catholic attempt to blow up Parliament and assassinate the king, only deepened public paranoia. James responded with repression but tried to maintain diplomatic ties with Catholic Spain, a move that angered the Protestant majority. His attempts to find middle ground ended with England bitterly divided and suspicious of its monarch's true loyalties. Even his greatest success, the commissioning of the King James Bible, was political in nature, designed to unify religious factions and reinforce his authority over the Church. It was an elegant solution to a fracturing problem, but one success couldn't balance out the weight of his failures. James governed with an irritating blend of theory and indulgence. He wanted to be both philosopher and autocrat, father and ruler. But England didn't want a father. It wanted a king who understood the delicate dance of constitutional monarchy. Instead, it got a man who believed he was smarter than the system and was constantly frustrated that the system didn't agree. By the time James died in 1625, he had set the stage for everything that would come next. Political gridlock, religious polarization, and an increasingly angry parliament. His son, Charles I, inherited more than a crown. He inherited a time bomb wrapped in royal parchment and tied with the ribbon of divine right. And where James theorized about kingship, Charles would act on it. And history would not be kind. 18. Charles I of England. Charles I wasn't the kind of king who stormed into disaster. He glided into it, dignified, devout, and utterly deaf to the sound of things falling apart behind him. If his father, James I, irritated Parliament with lofty theories of divine right, Charles turned theory into hard policy. Unbending where he should have negotiated, evasive when he should have explained, and stubborn when compromise was survival, Charles managed to take a country already cracking under pressure and drive it straight into civil war. When he became king in 1625, Charles inherited all of James's problems: religious division, financial instability, and a parliament that was already suspicious of royal overreach. But unlike James, Charles lacked even the faintest instinct for political theater. He wasn't charming, he wasn't strategic. He believed kingship was a sacred calling, his right, his duty, and crucially, no one else's business. From the start, he was in conflict with Parliament. They wouldn't give him the funds he wanted for foreign wars. He refused to explain his plans. When they questioned his spending, he dissolved Parliament. When they refused to approve taxes, he collected them anyway. And when legal challenges emerged, he brushed them aside with royal decrees. To many of his subjects, it wasn't just overreach. It was tyranny in real time. His personal rule from 1629 to 1640, known by critics as the 11 Years' Tyranny, was an unprecedented stretch of king-only governance. He found creative ways to raise money without Parliament, reviving ancient taxes like ship money, a levy traditionally reserved for coastal defense, but now applied to the entire country. It didn't go over well. Resistance mounted, lawsuits followed, and Charles responded the only way he knew how, with more rigidity. Then there was religion, because of course there was. Charles married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic queen, and aligned himself with Archbishop William Laud, a man whose reforms veered dangerously close to Catholic ritual in the eyes of Puritan England. Churches were refurbished with ornate decorations, altars were moved, and religious conformity was enforced. To many, it felt like Rome had crept back in through the side door, wearing velvet and quoting scripture. Dissenters were punished, imprisoned, or silenced. Public trust evaporated. When Charles finally recalled Parliament in 1640, desperate for funds to suppress a rebellion in Scotland, it was not the same Parliament he had dismissed. This one had a memory, a grudge, and a list of demands. The result was 2 years of political deadlock, followed by war. Civil War. From 1642 to 1649, England tore itself apart. Royalists fought for the king. Parliamentarians fought for reform. Charles, rather than negotiating a peace, clung to the idea of divine right like a shield. Even when captured, he remained unyielding. He played sides against each other, made promises. He never intended to keep and assumed his sacred kingship would protect him from consequences. It didn't. In 1649, after a trial that shocked the world, Charles I was convicted of high treason and executed, publicly on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. He met his death with dignity, but the damage had long been done. His rule had pushed England into republicanism, abolished the monarchy, temporarily, and changed forever the way subjects viewed their sovereigns. No longer untouchable, no longer unquestionable. So why is Charles I so deeply disliked? Because he governed like a man born in the wrong century, one who refused to accept that the world was changing around him. His devotion to principle became dangerous inflexibility. His faith in divine right made him blind to human consequence. He didn't just lose a war, he lost the moral high ground, the support of his people, and eventually his head. And yet, even after all that, the monarchy would return. But it would return wearing a different mask, one lined with laughter, scandal, and a very expensive wig. Because next came a king who had been through exile, tasted defeat, and came back determined to enjoy the job no matter the cost. A king who brought back the crown, and the chaos with it. 19. Charles II of England. If Charles I was the martyr king, rigid, tragic, and doomed, then Charles II was his glamorous, morally flexible resurrection. Known as the Merry Monarch, Charles II didn't just restore the English monarchy in 1660, he rebranded it. Gone were the days of solemn absolutism. In came the theater, the mistresses, the wigs, the irreverence. But behind the velvet curtains and endless parties was a ruler who never fully escaped the shadow of his father's downfall, and whose popularity waxed and waned under the weight of debt, disease, suspicion, and double-dealing. To his credit, Charles knew better than to repeat his father's mistakes. Upon returning from exile in France and the Netherlands, he made all the right noises: religious toleration, a constitutional monarchy, promises of stability. The people, exhausted by Cromwell's puritanical republic and the soul-crushing grayness of enforced godliness, welcomed him back like a breath of scandalous, perfumed air. He was tall, witty, and charming, everything a king should be, if you weren't too concerned with how he governed. But once the music faded, reality crept in. Charles's reign was a balancing act between indulgence and instability. Financially, he was always scrambling. Parliament, wary of royal overreach, kept a tight grip on the purse strings. Charles responded by making secret deals, most infamously the Treaty of Dover in 1670, where he agreed to convert to Catholicism, eventually, in exchange for cash from Louis XIV of France. It was a bargain dripping with hypocrisy, publicly Protestant, privately plotting with Catholic France, all while posturing as the defender of English liberty. Then there were the crises. The Great Plague of 1665 ravaged London. The Great Fire of 1666 destroyed it. Charles's responses were present. He walked the smoldering streets after the fire, helping direct efforts. But his court remained a symbol of excess in a time of national misery. His critics didn't see a steady hand. They saw a king dancing while the city burned. And if the fires and plagues weren't enough, there were the religious tensions. Charles promised tolerance, but Parliament pushed back with the Clarendon Code, laws that penalized Catholics and non-Anglicans. Charles signed them, then tried to bypass them, then wavered again. His reluctance to confront Parliament directly earned him some praise, but also the reputation of a king who ruled through backroom deals and delayed decisions. His court became infamous for its decadence. Mistresses like Barbara Palmer and Nell Gwynn were household names. He had no legitimate children, but acknowledged over a dozen illegitimate ones. The nobility grumbled. The Puritans seethed. Even supporters began to wonder whether their monarch had mistaken the throne for a stage and the realm for a party. And behind all this was the one looming problem Charles never resolved: succession. His brother James, Duke of York, was openly Catholic. The prospect of a Catholic king sparked panic. The exclusion crisis of the late 1670s saw Parliament attempt to bar James from the throne. Charles dissolved Parliament multiple times to protect his brother's right, asserting royal authority but undermining trust in the process. He won the fight, but not the argument. So why is Charles II on the list of most disliked English royals? Because his charm masked a deeper failure to lead with clarity or conviction. He restored the monarchy, yes, but he never restored its credibility. He played both sides, postponed decisions, and prioritized comfort over courage. His reign didn't collapse, but it creaked. And that creaking laid the foundation for the next great crisis. Because when Charles died in 1685, the crown passed to the very man he spent his life trying to protect. A man less charming, more devout, and wholly unprepared for how little patience England had left. 20. James II of England. James II wasn't just disliked. He was ejected. Not overthrown in war or murdered in secret, but formally, publicly, and with unnerving speed. It wasn't a rebellion or a coup. It was a dismissal. Parliament called it the Glorious Revolution, but for James, it was more like a divine right performance cut short by bad polling numbers and a sudden loss of stage time. One day he was king. The next, he was on a boat to France, leaving his crown behind like a forgotten hat. Crowned in 1685, James inherited not just the throne from his brother Charles II, but also the growing anxiety that surrounded him. The problem wasn't just that he was Catholic in a country that had made anti-Catholicism a patriotic virtue. It was that James seemed to have no interest in even pretending to balance faith and politics. Where Charles had played both sides with flair and misdirection, James barreled ahead with certainty and blunt conviction. At first, many were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. After all, he was a seasoned military man, loyal to the crown and, for a time, outwardly cautious. But the caution didn't last. He filled key government and military positions with Catholics, suspended laws without Parliament's consent, and aggressively promoted religious toleration through royal decree. Toleration, in theory, was progressive. But in practice, James wasn't just tolerating Catholics. He was elevating them while simultaneously marginalizing Protestants, bypassing Parliament, and leaning heavily on absolutist principles imported from the French court of Louis XIV. It didn't help that he kept comparing his rule to that of the Catholic monarchs of Europe. To Protestant England, this sounded less like policy and more like warning bells. The tipping point came in 1688 with the birth of James's son, a male Catholic heir. Until then, many in England had comforted themselves with the idea that James's rule was a temporary inconvenience. His Protestant daughter Mary, married to the Dutch Protestant William of Orange, was next in line. But a Catholic dynasty? That was too much. Rumors swirled that the child was smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan, a ludicrous conspiracy, but one that found fertile ground in a country already suspicious of its king. Within months, leading nobles invited William of Orange to intervene. He arrived with a fleet and an army, and instead of a battle, he was met with mass defections. Even James's own daughter Mary and her husband William stood against him. The army, the nobles, even members of the royal court melted away. James fled, was caught, then fled again, this time successfully. And just like that, Parliament declared the throne vacant. Not just unoccupied, vacant. They argued that James had abdicated by fleeing, and in his place, they crowned William and Mary as joint monarchs under a new constitutional framework. The monarchy survived, but it was permanently changed. Kings would now rule with Parliament, not over it. So why is James II so disliked? Because he turned a crisis of religion into a crisis of government. He believed so deeply in his right to rule that he ignored the political reality around him. His version of tolerance came without consent. His version of kingship came without compromise. And his confidence in divine right led him to mistake stubbornness for strength, until his own people showed him the door. But what came after James was no return to simplicity. Because the monarchs who replaced him weren't just placeholders. They were foreign rulers, new power brokers, and reluctant inheritors of a throne built on contradiction. And their reign would show that sometimes, even a glorious revolution leaves behind a very complicated mess. 21. William III and Mary II of England. It's not easy to take over a country by invitation and still end up resented. But William III and Mary II managed it, joint monarchs of the so-called Glorious Revolution, who came to power on a wave of Protestant relief and left behind a reign that, for many, felt like a cold transaction rather than a restoration. They were supposed to save the kingdom from tyranny. Instead, they turned it into a battleground of loyalty, suspicion, and contradiction. Let's begin with the premise. They weren't English. William of Orange was Dutch. His wife Mary, though born in England, had been raised abroad and spent most of her life in the orbit of European Protestantism. Their ascension in 1689 wasn't a victory won in battle. It was a contract negotiated with Parliament. In return for the crown, they accepted the Bill of Rights, effectively surrendering many of the absolute powers English monarchs had once wielded. It was a constitutional milestone. But it also meant William and Mary ruled not as sovereigns by divine right, but as managers, caretakers of a monarchy on parliamentary probation. To the Whigs, they were heroes. To the Tories, they were interlopers. To the Jacobites, supporters of the deposed James II, they were usurpers. It's hard to govern a country that only half believes you belong there. William's personal demeanor didn't help. He was cold, stern, and chronically ill, with a military mind and little patience for English court politics. He spoke with an accent, relied heavily on Dutch advisors, and preferred campaigning on the continent to hosting English banquets. He saw England not as a cultural home, but as a base of operations in his larger war against Louis XIV of France. For him, the English crown was a strategic asset, a means to fund and staff his lifelong grudge match with French Catholicism. Mary, more English and more emotionally engaged, fared slightly better in public opinion. But her own role in her father's downfall, agreeing to take the crown that had been stripped from him, left a permanent stain. Even those who accepted the political necessity of James II's removal found her personal complicity difficult to stomach. The crown may have been offered, but she had to reach out and take it. And she did. Together, they ruled in awkward tandem. Mary governed alone when William was away at war, and by most accounts, did so competently. But she was never fully trusted by either side. Too pious and reserved for the cosmopolitan elites. Too complicit in the revolution for the devout loyalists. Her death in 1694 from smallpox at age 32 left William to rule alone, and public affection never quite rallied around him. Religious tension didn't disappear under their rule. It metastasized. The 1689 Toleration Act granted limited freedoms to Protestant dissenters but excluded Catholics entirely. Anti-Catholic sentiment hardened, and paranoia about Jacobite uprisings haunted William's every move. In Ireland, William crushed the Jacobites at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, a Protestant victory, but one that deepened sectarian wounds that still haven't fully healed. So why are William and Mary disliked? Because their rule felt transactional rather than transformational. They were a monarchy built on compromise, but never warmth. Their arrival signaled a victory for constitutionalism, yes, but also a permanent fracture in the perceived sanctity of kingship. The monarch was now answerable not to God, but to Parliament. That's progress, but it wasn't popular. Not to the old guard, not to the clergy, and not to the families torn apart by divided loyalties. William died in 1702 after being thrown from his horse, tripped by a molehill, as the Jacobites like to say. A mole allegedly working for the little gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat. It was a fitting end for a king whose greatest enemy was always lurking just beneath the surface. And after him came the last of the Stuart queens, a monarch who tried to heal the divides and keep the peace, but whose reign was marked by whispers of incompetence, favoritism, and a slow, heavy decline into irrelevance. 22. Anne of England. Queen Anne's reign is often remembered as the calm after the constitutional storm, a period of wigs, and wars, fought far from home. But beneath the powdered surface was a monarch so racked with personal tragedy, political manipulation, and emotional dependency that by the end of her reign, the crown looked less like a symbol of unity and more like an inherited burden no one quite knew what to do with. Anne came to the throne in 1702, the last of the Stuart monarchs and the final act in a dynasty that had lurched from absolutism to exile to imported Dutch Protestantism. She wasn't charismatic. She wasn't politically astute. and she wasn't well. By the time she was crowned, Anne was chronically ill, overweight, and emotionally fragile, traits her contemporaries noticed with far less charity than modern historians might. But perhaps the most tragic part of her legacy? She was a queen without an heir. 17 pregnancies, and not one child lived to adulthood. The losses defined her life, and they shaped her reign. In a court obsessed with succession and dynastic continuity, Anne's inability to produce an heir wasn't just a personal grief, it was a political catastrophe in slow motion. Her reign began with promise. England was in the thick of the War of the Spanish Succession, and Anne inherited a stable military machine led by the brilliant Duke of Marlborough. Victories abroad brought prestige, and the 1707 Acts of Union, uniting England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain, should have been the jewel in her crown. But the act, rather than symbolizing unity, sparked resentment. Many Scots saw it as a forced marriage, politically necessary, emotionally hollow. The English weren't particularly romantic about it either. Then there were the politics at home. Anne's court was dominated by factions, the Whigs and the Tories, each trying to pull the aging, indecisive queen into their orbit. For most of her reign, Anne leaned toward the Tories, favoring their Anglican conservatism and suspicion of foreign entanglements. But her early years were heavily influenced by Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, Anne's childhood friend, closest confidant, and, for a time, emotional anchor. That friendship, however, decayed into bitterness. Sarah was opinionated, forceful, and politically ambitious. Anne, more introverted and defensive, began to resent her overbearing influence. The deterioration of their relationship, played out in letters, snubs, and court gossip, was one of the most infamous political divorces in royal history. Sarah was eventually replaced by Abigail Masham, a quieter, more pliant cousin whose closeness to Anne sparked its own rumors and accusations of manipulation. By the final years of her reign, Anne was increasingly isolated. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Gout, dropsy, and mobility issues left her confined to her rooms. Ministers came and went, unable to sustain favor or unity. And looming over it all was the succession crisis. With no surviving children, Parliament had to look abroad, far abroad, for a Protestant heir. They landed on the House of Hanover, a German dynasty whose nearest link to Anne was through her late grandfather, James I. So why is Anne disliked, or at the very least, dismissed? Because she was the wrong queen at the wrong time for a country that was no longer looking for monarchy in its traditional form. She wasn't decisive enough for the politicians, not glamorous enough for the public, and not ruthless enough for the job. Her personal sorrows bled into her political choices, and her preference for quiet loyalty over bold leadership left her court feeling more like a waiting room than a seat of power. When Anne died in 1714, the crown passed to a foreign relative no one had ever met. The Stuarts were done, and Britain entered the era of imported kings, constitutional restraint, and parliamentary supremacy. But not before one final echo of medieval monarchy stirred again. A king who wore the crown like armor, ruled with suspicion, and left behind nothing but questions. Because buried between wars and pageants was one more unpopular royal whose reputation would gradually erode, despite once being called the sun in splendor. 23. Edward IV of England. Edward IV was supposed to be the Yorkist answer to everything. Handsome, tall, charismatic, and victorious in battle, he embodied the opposite of what England had come to expect from its kings during the endless churn of the Wars of the Roses. For a brief, shining moment, it looked as though he might finally stabilize the crown, end the dynastic chaos, and become the unifying figure the realm so desperately needed. And then he blew it. He wasn't hated because he was weak. He was hated because he wasn't supposed to fail. But behind the charm, behind the military swagger and the well-tailored doublets, Edward IV ruled with an unsettling mixture of favoritism, vengeance, and indulgence. He didn't lose the throne once because he was outmatched. He lost it because he underestimated everyone around him, including his so-called friends. Edward came to power in 1461, barely out of his teens, after his father, the Duke of York, was killed in battle. Backed by the cunning Earl of Warwick, known ominously as the Kingmaker, Edward swept the Lancastrians off the field and took the throne from Henry VI, a man so unsuited for rule he made Edward look like Alexander the Great by comparison. But the victory was not a clean break. It was a chessboard full of unpaid debts, wounded egos, and alliances built on very thin ice. The trouble began when Edward decided to marry Elizabeth Woodville in secret in 1464. She was a commoner by noble standards, a widow, and a Lancastrian to boot. Worse, she wasn't the foreign princess Warwick had been negotiating for, someone who could have brought continental alliances and legitimacy. By bypassing Warwick and marrying for love or lust, Edward sent a loud message. Loyalty was optional, and personal desire would always outrank political prudence. The fallout was immediate. The Woodvilles were elevated at court, married off to powerful nobles, and began consolidating influence at an alarming pace. The old nobility, especially Warwick, were outraged. Warwick switched sides, backed a rebellion, and even restored Henry VI to the throne for a short time in 1470. Edward was exiled. It was a humiliating reversal for a man who'd once seemed invincible. But then Edward came back. In 1471, with military precision and brutal clarity, he crushed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet and eliminated the Lancastrian threat at Tewkesbury. Henry VI was conveniently dead shortly after. The throne was his again, this time for good. And yet the second half of his reign was anything but golden. Edward ruled with a thin skin and a long memory. He favored those who had stood by him and punished those who hadn't. Power was increasingly centralized around his household and the Woodville faction, shutting out rival nobles. His brother George, Duke of Clarence, always a schemer, was eventually executed for treason, possibly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, or so the legend goes. Whether true or not, the detail speaks to how far court politics had descended into grotesque theater. Edward also indulged himself to excess. His once sharp military mind gave way to lavish living, elaborate court festivities, and chronic overindulgence in food, drink, and vice. His popularity waned not because he lost control of the battlefield, but because he lost control of the court, and of himself. The sense of betrayal among the older nobility never fully disappeared. The kingdom was at peace, but it was an uneasy peace, one that depended entirely on Edward staying alive and his enemies staying quiet. He died suddenly in 1483, at just 40 years old, leaving behind a young son, Edward Fatih, and a kingdom perched precariously on a knife's edge. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector. Within weeks, Richard would take the crown for himself. Edward's children would vanish into the Tower. The Yorkist dream would shatter. So why is Edward IV viewed with distaste, despite his achievements? Because he won the throne twice, and still failed to secure a lasting legacy. He inspired loyalty, then squandered it. He elevated his family, then left them exposed. He broke the feudal system's rules in the name of love, then ruled like a petty king who couldn't forget a grudge. His reign was a lesson in lost potential, power achieved but never matured. And worse, his death unleashed a darker legacy than even he could have imagined. Because the next royal name tied to his bloodline would become a symbol not of triumph, but of suspicion, disappearance, and one of England's most enduring and unsettling historical mysteries. 24. Mary I of Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots, is a historical paradox. Romanticized to the point of sainthood, villainized to the edge of treason, and somehow both adored and loathed in equal measure across the centuries. Though not technically Queen of England, she earns her place here not by ruling it, but by haunting it, looming over the English crown as a dynastic threat, a Catholic symbol, and eventually a royal embarrassment that had to be dealt with. And while she is often seen as a tragic heroine, many in her own time saw something far less sympathetic. A reckless queen whose personal disasters spilled across borders. Born in 1542 and crowned Queen of Scots when she was just 6 days old, Mary's life was political from the moment she took her first breath. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII of England, making her a legitimate contender for the English throne. This single fact shaped her entire life, and ensured she would never be left alone by either friend or foe. Raised in the French court and married to the future Francis II, Mary returned to Scotland in 1561 after his death. What she walked into was a nation at odds with itself, torn between Catholicism and Protestant reform, noble factions clawing at each other for power, and a suspicious population who didn't quite know what to make of a queen raised abroad, speaking French, dressed in silks, and bearing continental manners that reeked of foreign rule. Mary's rule in Scotland was a slow theatrical train wreck, made worse by her fatal weakness for disastrous marriages. Her union with Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, chosen for his English royal blood, was supposed to bolster her claim to the English throne. Instead, it unraveled her image. Darnley was arrogant, violent, and increasingly unhinged. In 1567, he was murdered under suspicious circumstances. His house exploded, and his body was found in the garden, strangled but unburnt. Mary married the chief suspect, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, within months. To call it a scandal is an understatement. Nobles rebelled. The public turned against her. Her claim to divine rule began to look more like a soap opera. She was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son James VI, and eventually fled across the border to England, seeking protection from her cousin Queen Elizabeth I. That, as history would show, was a mistake. To Elizabeth, Mary was a problem that couldn't be solved. As a Catholic, she became a rallying point for English Catholics who considered Elizabeth's reign illegitimate. As a queen with a better dynastic claim, depending on your reading of Henry VIII's will, she was a constant political threat. And as a woman of impulsive decisions and suspicious alliances, she was impossible to control. Mary was held under house arrest for 19 years, confined in castles and manors under heavy supervision. During this time, a series of plots, some real, some imagined, tied her name to rebellion, assassination, and foreign invasion. The most infamous, the Babington Plot, involved a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Whether or not she knew the details, her name was on the correspondence. Elizabeth signed the death warrant. Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle in 1587. Her last moments were recorded with theatrical solemnity. Dressed in red, the color of Catholic martyrdom, she delivered lines worthy of a saint. It worked. She died more beloved than she had lived. So why does Mary I of Scotland rank among the most hated, or at least most distrusted royals? Because her reign was a masterclass in self-destruction. She mistook charm for governance, romance for strategy, and divine right for actual political leverage. Her choices destabilized a fragile kingdom, provoked civil war, and created an international crisis that nearly cost Elizabeth her throne. She was not merely unlucky, she was careless with power, both her own and that of those around her. And while the history books may soften her legacy with martyrdom and tragedy, her contemporaries saw something far grimmer, a queen who walked into ruin with her eyes open. And yet, even her missteps paled beside the sheer scale of damage left by her English cousin, the man next in our list, whose ambitions shattered the church, the court, and the very idea of marriage as a sacred bond, a king who ruled not with mercy or moderation, but appetite. 25. Edward III of England. Edward III is a king with a confusing legacy. For centuries, he was celebrated as a national hero, a warrior king, founder of the Order of the Garter, reviver of chivalry, and the man who ignited the 100 Years' War with France. He ruled for 50 years, oversaw epic victories like Crécy and Poitiers, and left behind a dynasty that looked on paper like a golden age. And yet, pull back the banners, the shining armor, the romantic tales of mounted knights, and you're left with something far less inspiring. A reign that began with a coup, ended in slow decay, and left England politically unstable, financially drained, and on a straight path to civil war. Edward III wasn't hated in his time the way King John or Richard III were, but in hindsight, his reign is less a triumph and more a ticking time bomb. Let's start at the beginning. Edward came to the throne in 1327 at just 14 years old, following the forced abdication of his father, Edward II, an unpopular monarch deposed by his wife, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward III began his reign as a puppet, while Mortimer and Isabella ruled in his name. But in 1330, at age 18, Edward staged a coup of his own. He arrested Mortimer and had him executed. Isabella was sidelined, and just like that, Edward took control of his kingdom, with dramatic flair and the political instincts of someone twice his age. For a while things went well. Edward built a strong court, surrounded himself with loyal nobles, and poured energy into military ventures that won him early acclaim. He laid claim to the French throne in 1337, kicking off what would become the 100 Years' War. His victories were impressive. At Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, English forces, heavily reliant on longbowmen, crushed larger French armies. His son, Edward the Black Prince, emerged as a chivalric icon. France was humiliated. England basked in glory. But victories don't pay for themselves. War is expensive, and Edward's campaigns drained the treasury. To fund them, he leaned heavily on taxes, loans, and wool exports. Parliament grumbled. Merchants grumbled louder. And when the plague arrived in 1348, yes, the Black Death, it tore through the country, killing an estimated third to half of the population. Labor shortages followed. Wages rose. Edward responded with wage controls and labor laws that locked workers into their jobs, sparking resentment that would fester for generations. As he aged, Edward's grip on power loosened. After the death of the Black Prince in 1376, the court descended into factionalism. Corruption bloomed. Edward became increasingly dependent on his mistress, Alice Perrers, whose influence over the king and court enraged Parliament. She was accused of manipulating the elderly king, of enriching herself at the public's expense, and of presiding over a decaying royal household. The Good Parliament of 1376, one of England's earliest serious attempts at reform, demanded her removal and pressed for accountability. Edward, old and infirm, resisted. The reforms failed. Discontent deepened. By the time Edward died in 1377, the heroic image was already tarnished. He left behind a kingdom financially strained, socially unstable, and politically fractured. His grandson, Richard II, just 10 years old at the time, would inherit not only the crown but also the increasingly unsustainable weight of Edward's unfinished business. So why is Edward III viewed with discomfort, if not outright dislike? Because he represents the illusion of glory masking the reality of decline. His military successes dazzled his contemporaries, but they also locked England into a century-long war with France that would cost generations of lives and treasure. His long reign masked growing economic inequality and a monarchy increasingly dependent on unpopular taxes and war profits. He built a powerful royal image but failed to create a durable political structure behind it. When the lights dimmed, what was left was a hollow stage and actors scrambling for direction. Edward III wanted to be a legend, and in some ways he got his wish. But legends don't govern. They distract. They inspire pride, while quietly postponing reckoning. And as England marched into the 15th century, what followed wasn't more glory. It was fracture, rebellion, and kings who barely held the throne long enough to rule. Kings like the one whose Scottish campaigns collapsed, whose court turned against him, and whose reputation even among his own nobles was that of a burden best replaced.